I really wish that I was like in a position to like do new research, but I just have this feeling that it would honestly involve like um, living in Europe and living in Jena for one thing, or one of the places that is significant for Hegel studies.
Must be
I'm
huge
here. I'm just
studies going
clicking
on in the
things.
UK. Must be some significant Hegel studies going on in the UK because that's what Holgate is.
I think Cambridge pretty big on Hegel, even their non-metaphysics version of it.
Yeah.
Oh wow, cool. Didn't think to change that setting, but you got it.
Well, thanks.
Oh yeah, I forgot that maybe also literally uses these paragraph numbers as reference.
It's not a bad thing, especially when
Oh
you're going step by step through it.
yeah,
I I
but
truth be told, I've actually gotten so used to using the humanity books, Science of Logic with no numbers that it actually kind of looks weird with all the paragraphs numbered on here. I started to read up a little bit about A.V. Miller, and apparently the translation standard he used for the Science of Logic, which was the first, was different from what he eventually did with Phenomenology of Spirit. Science of Logic, and thank God, he actually didn't look on it so much as a literary work as something that was supposed to be scientifically rigorous, and so he didn't look for thesaurus adjacent definitions of Aufheben. In the phenomenology of logic, he did, unfortunately. And some people think it's a good thing, because it breaks up the monotony. Some people think it's bad because they're like, okay, uh, does he mean the same thing or does he not? Because in the science of logic with Miller, the category is the category. Like he does, or the action of the categories is pretty much the same throughout, which is helpful because I think you would lose your place if you didn't have that. So um, it's a book. Um, it's a book by a British. I think it's a British guy. Maybe it's not a British. I don't know. But unfortunately, his standard for the work. Oh, no, that's not what I was looking for. Oh well. Anyway, his standard from the look was to use uh, Bourdieu and a couple other people talking about intersectional life experiences and stuff of the translator to like figure out what the translator's standard was based on their life story and stuff. So it's a really interesting subject directly involving the translator of Hegel's works, but it's from like a soft sociological point of view which I really regret, you know, because it's like, okay, how much do I care about the author's framing? You know what I mean? So I've toyed with getting the book, but do I really want to spend $60 picking it up and being like, this isn't that great? So ultimately, I have the PDF. So, all right, we're gonna get started. For those of you watching, we're gonna talk about um, the idea, chapter one, life, and we're just gonna read through some because it's actually not that long from what I can tell. Well, okay,
About 10 pages.
yeah, it's longer than I think. This is just the opening, but even if we just read the opening, it's a pretty good deal. So I'm going to start off reading, and then we can talk about it. All right. The idea of life is concerned with a subject matter so concrete and, if you will, so real that with it we may seem to have overstepped the domain of logic as it is commonly conceived. Certainly, if logic were to contain nothing but empty, dead forms of thought, there could be no mention in it at all of such a content as the idea of life. But if absolute truth is the subject matter of logic, and truth as such is essentially in cognition, then cognition at least would have to be discussed. So-called pure logic is usually followed up with an applied logic, a logic dealing with concrete cognition, not to mention the massive psychology and anthropology that is often deemed necessary to interpolate into logic. Okay, yeah, I'm just going to finish the thing and then we'll talk about it. But the anthropological and psychological side of cognition is concerned with its manifested aspect, in which the notion on its own account has not yet come to have an objectivity the same as itself, that is, to have itself for object. The part of logic that treats of this concrete side does not belong to applied logic as such. If it did, then every science would have to be dragged into logic, for each is an applied logic insofar as it consists in apprehending its subject matter in forms of thought and the notion. The subjective notion has presuppositions which present themselves in psychological, anthropological, and other forms. But to logic, to logic, only the presuppositions of the pure notion insofar as they have the form of pure thoughts, of abstract essentialities, that is, the determinations of being in essence. Similarly, in respective cognition, the notion's apprehension of itself, logic will not deal with other shapes of its presupposition, but only with that which is itself idea. Wow. Oh, I need some coffee or tea or something. This latter, however, necessarily falls to be dealt with in logic. Now, this presupposition is the immediate idea for since cognition is the notion insofar as this is for itself, but as a subjectivity is in relation to an objectivity, the notion is related to the idea as presupposed or immediate idea. But the immediate idea is life. Okay, so this paragraph actually discloses an awful lot about Hegel's project. I think more than people realize. Number one thing is that he tells you, first of all, how he deals with writing about everyday things. Okay, and when he does so with the point of view that he talks about here called the applied logic. And it's the logic dealing with psychology, anything that's necessary to interpolate into logic. Okay. Yeah, and he even goes on to say if every science would have to be dragged into logic, for each is an applied logic insofar as it consists in apprehending its subject matter in forms of thought and the notion. And that's interesting. He says both forms of thought and the notion. And here I think he's really trying to accent the fact of the dialectic of being. The dialectic of being is both thought and existing being. Those are the dual sides. And he often brings it up, but he does it in such a way that it almost looks like he's just talking about something outside of being. But when he says things of, forms of thought and the notion, wouldn't the form of notion be the same as thought? Why be redundant there? And I think this is really, a case of starting to talk about concrete things as having the notion part of its structure, and then notion uppercase N, or category, or whatever you want to call it, is well, I mean, it's the externalized idea is nature, and the idea brought home to itself is spirit from nature. So I feel like he's talking about the same thing, but I could be wrong. He also talks about here how logic, the objective logic, is being an essence, and those presuppose subjective. Help me out here. Where am I looking? He said subjective. Come on. Subjective idea? No.
You have
Subjective notion. Yes. There we go. Subjective notion is the thinking process, and what makes it up. Kyle, Jim, any thoughts? He really gives you some of the battle map right here in this paragraph, because so many people, there's an entire length of books on my shelf that try to map Marx's Capital on Hegel's logic. And this paragraph blows all of those away in embarrassing ways, because Capital is an example of applied logic. So why would you take an applied logic and try to map it onto the logic itself, right? It doesn't make sense. You're trying to make, yeah, in Hegel's words, you're trying to make a finite subject an infinite one. And Marx is very specific throughout Capital, especially in the second and third volume, that Capital is not an infinite entity. It's historical. It has a beginning and an end, and its end leads outside it, right? Yeah, yeah. It tells me that they, first of all, they haven't read the logic thoroughly, which I know is hard. It takes time. It takes years to master the stuff, or maybe a few months if you're fine with intensive living. But I've got two kids, so it's like, you get away with as much as you can. Okay, I'm going to shut up. You guys go. This paragraph is everything, guys.
Oh, I think the answer to the question is, as Holgate at one points pointed out, this the logic is not really studied that much in English speaking countries, at least.
Yeah.
And maybe not, it may be elsewhere too.
Yeah.
No.
You're absolutely right.
In college or graduate school, people tend to focus more like on the phenomenology, or on a philosophy of history, things like that.
Or the philosophy of right.
Yeah.
And they love critiquing philosophy of right on young Marx's coattails, because they think, first of all, because they think that Marx had the correct interpretation, and all you have to really do is treat it like a catechism. Received knowledge. It's it's a positive philosophy. We received it from the church. It's correct. Nothing needs to be said anymore other than, illuminating this or that passage that hardly anyone reads, maybe, It's it's one of those things Hegel hated throughout his lifetime, was the idea of received knowledge, and the fact that that was, I mean, it's literally dogma. It was even called that by the church, and hewn to as a matter of proof of belief. You know what I mean? So yeah, Jim, you're absolutely right. Hardly ever, anyone ever reads it, and to me, especially reading any of Hegel's finished works outside of the logic, outside of the system, actually, right? Which is everything else. How exactly are you going to be able to read those without becoming at least familiar with the logic? Like what's applied to it in the first place? It's difficult, right? It's read by ruling class bourgeois standards, which are all soft sociology or hard sciences. And because Hegel doesn't fit in either at all, because, he sublates everything into his system, they can only read him one-sidedly, veering from one side to the other of the dialectic, but never staying in both lanes at once, right? Straight down that middle line. You know what I mean? Okay. I'm getting entirely too excited about this. Kyle, 1646, please.
To this extent, the necessary of treating the idea of life in logic would be based on the necessary, otherwise recognized too, of treating here of the concrete notion of cognition. But this idea has come upon the scene through the notion's own necessity. The idea, which is true in and for itself, is essentially the subject matter of logic. Since it is first considered in its immediacy, it must be apprehended and cognized in its determinateness, in which it is life, in order that its treatment shall not be empty affair, void of determinate content. All that we need perhaps to remark is how far the logical view of life differs from any other scientific view of it. This is not the place, however, to concern ourselves with how life is treated in the unphilosophical sciences, but only with differentiating logical life as pure idea from natural life, which is dealt with the philosophy of nature, and from life insofar as it stands in connection with spirit. The former of these, as the life of nature, is life as projected into the externality of existence, and having its condition in inorganic nature, and where the moments of the idea are a multiplicity of actual formations. Life is the idea is without such presuppositions, which are in the form of shapes of actuality. Its presupposition is the notion as we have considered it. On the one hand as subjective, on the other hand as objective. In nature, life appears at the highest stage, a stage that is nature's externality attains by withdrawing into itself and sublating itself in subjectivity. In logic, it is simple inwardness, which in the idea of life has attained an externality that genuinely corresponds to it. The notion that earlier appeared on the scene as subjective notion is the soul of life itself. It is the urge that mediates for itself its reality through objectivity. Nature, having reached this idea from the starting point of its externality, transcends itself. Its end does not appear as its beginning, but as its limit, which it sublates itself. Similarly, in the idea of life, the moments of its reality do not receive the shape of external actuality, but remain enclosed within the form of the notion. So I'm trying to think. Let me go grab that note. Okay. I'm trying to think because something I got out of this from maybe is where life is doubly for itself. I'm thinking starting to show itself here, in which because that life at this point is the universal is the shoot, the judgment of the universal is singular in the sense that life in the universal is through all the singulars that is each individual life form. So that's universal through each of its singulars. Plus, also, it's something that can be the subject of its own activity versus like a toaster or any sort of machine that requires user input to do anything, right? Um, so it's the only thing that's capable of motivating itself. That urge we see here, which he talks about more later on, with it being the way of externalizing itself and bringing the external world into itself.
Yeah, this is one of those paragraphs where some more of the instructions appear on how to read the logic. Like when he says
Oh yeah.
life in the idea is without such presuppositions. In other words, presuppositions of externality as existence, right? Which are in the forms of shapes of actuality. Its presupposition is the notion, as we have considered it, on the one hand as subjective, on the other hand as objective. And so here, and you might be thinking, okay, this is profoundly anti-Marxist because he's saying that the historical doesn't matter for life as such. And you're going to encounter this again in Philosophy of Nature, where he basically says, paraphrasing, he's saying that the notion or the idea of, and I use that with a capital or with a lowercase I, the idea of evolution, he says, is bunk. It's crap. But he doesn't mean it in the way that Darwin meant it, because that was like 75 years away. And the way he means it is in a logical sense, not in the historical sense. So here he says, and I'll just say it again, life, okay, the life of nature is life as projected into the externality of existence, having its condition in organic nature. Okay? Life in the idea, is without such presuppositions which are in the form of shapes of actuality. So he's saying that life in externality, you know, presupposes thought and categories, but life in the idea is without such presuppositions. Its only presupposition is the notion as constructed in the first two books. So he's reiterating that the only presuppositions that exist for life are the two books that just pass by, and the progress up through the notion getting to life. And that's it, as far as the idea goes. The logical order, the logical nature of being and thought, right? As constructed. I mean, we've come across early categories that we would have in normal parlance thought of as having to be presupposed by time and space. Right? We usually think of being, right, as being historically presupposed by time and space. But time and space are externalized idea after the logic of the idea is constructed. And so the structure of being is actually prior to time and space.
I guess I could say as a corollary to that, there is a time-like concept before time itself exists, or becoming, which is pretty much the core of the entire movement.
Right.
Here in subject, not in life.
Yeah. And I really think this issue in general across the work is part of why it's a safer bet to just talk about the categories of thought and to call Hegel an idealist, because dealing with the logical implications of the categories of being, which it is at the same time. It's dialectical, right? It's so much harder to picture in your head. How can a state of time pre-exist time logically, right? Well, if you think about it, he's really talking about the structure of reality,
Yeah.
and building it up logically from the abstract to the concrete. So it's never a matter of saying historically that some of the conditions that we experience in time pre-exist reality itself. He's just saying that logically, it has to have been a developed logical moment before it can be a moment of time, of space. Does that make sense? A little bit.
Kind of like there's a fundamental rule that logic dictates that has to be possible for it to ever exist in reality.
And remember the objective categories that make up the notion are a combination of reality in general and reality in thought. You know, I mean, if you really get down to what mediation is, it's it's us thinking through the things, you know, and so you're probably thinking, okay, well, how do we separate us and what is in general? And Hegel's answer is that you cannot. Like there's this idea that because we're looking at something, we're changing the results, right? Like in quantum theory. But the fact is that, you know, we're dealing with the nature of knowledge, which is created by us and trying to edit ourselves out of it to try to see what's there if we weren't there at all. But if being is dialectical, it doesn't matter. We could be gone in a million years and the reality structure will be the same. Um, it's going to still, it'll still be obeying the same rules of physics when we're gone, you know. Okay. All right. Jim, 1647, please.
Okay. Life considered now more closely in its idea
Oh
is
no. 1647.
okay.
In spirit, however.
In spirit, however, life appears partly as opposed to it, partly as posited as at one with it, this unity being reborn as the offspring of spirit. For here, life is to be taken generally in its proper sense as natural life, for what is called the life of spirit as spirit is its peculiar nature that a
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
peculiar nature that stands opposed to mere life, just as we speak too of the nature of spirit, of a spirit is not a natural being and is rather the opposite of nature. Life as such, then, is a spirit, is for spirit partly a means, and as such, spirit opposes it to itself. Partly, spirit is a living individual, and life is its body. And again, this unity of spirit with its living corporeality is born from spirit itself as an ideal. None of these relations to spirit concerns logical life, and life is to be considered here neither as instrument uh, of the spirit, nor as a moment of the ideal and of beauty. Both cases as natural life and as life standing in relation with spirit, life possesses a determinateness of its externality. In the first case, through its presuppositions, which are other formations of nature. In the second case, through the ends and nature of spirit. The idea of life is by itself is free from the further presupposed and conditioning objectivity as well as from relation to the latter subjectivity.
Thanks. Yeah. So here he talks about spirit and its relation to nature. And remember, prior to Hegel and even Kant, you had Descartes and all these other people who were positing that, what they called the body and the soul were separate, and one was the vehicle for the other. And here he's showing too that they're still that they can still be looked at separately, but really they're a whole, a unity. One without the other would just make no sense. But he does so logically. And again he repeats this idea a little better than previously that uh, uh, that um, life in relation to spirit has its presuppositions in nature. So he believes in historical materialism. That, he's acknowledging directly here his fidelity to historical materialism in saying, in both cases, as natural life and as life standing in relation with spirit, life possesses a determinateness of its externality. In other words, a definiteness in real life, right? Concrete real life. In the first case, through its presuppositions, which are other formations of nature. In the second case, through the ends and the activity of spirit. And then he caps it off by repeating what he said in the previous paragraph. The idea of life by itself is free from the former presupposed and conditioning objectivity, as well as from relation to the latter subjectivity. The idea of life, the only presuppositions are being in essence and the notion up to now. So the way he breaks this out, it's very hard, I think, to think of Hegel as purely idealist, because here clearly it's a much more complicated story.
As Lenin realized.
Yes. And to this day, even people who acknowledge that he wrote commentary on Hegel swear up and down he didn't actually do anything with it. And what they don't realize is that most of his work after that was, as best he could, I think, examples of applied logic, although he didn't always express himself in those terms. Marx was able in the end to express himself in those terms in Capital, but it took him decades to get it right to where he was able to be like, okay, you know, not only in selecting the correct beginning, but also being able to give the categories their due. You know what I mean? You read Capital. I mean, the first chapter alone, the first section, is littered with all of these categories we've been going through, like directly that word. At least in the English translation, I'd have to look at the German, but I have the feeling Ben Folks tried to be really, you know, tried to bring a measure of fidelity to the English words to get the categories of being an essence across in the correct way, using words like substance, you know, quality, quantity, measure, magnitude, right? Appearance. First sentence uses the word appearance, you know. How is this a show? For instance, any other thoughts?
Well, the Soviet Union, they generally use Lenin's earlier work, the materialism and imperial criticism, as a main philosophical text. And so, to my knowledge, they generally neglected Lenin's later stuff, especially like his writings on the commentaries on Hegel.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I actually think that book is a good book for what it was. You know, um, but to turn it into a dogma like the Soviet Union later did, I think was their ultimate mistake. None of this should be turned into a dogma. And even this book, like this book, lives or dies on the cogency of its logical ideas, as presented in this, in this way, right? So yeah, I'm gonna read 1648. Life, considered now more closely in its idea, is in and for itself absolute universality. The objectivity that it possesses is permeated through by the notion and has the notion alone for substance. What is distinguished as part or in accordance with some other external reflection has within itself the whole notion. The notion is the omnipresent soul in it, which remains simple self-relation and remains a one in the multiplicity belonging to objective being. Now, you notice from this first couple of sentences, it almost sounds like it doesn't make sense. But if you think about what life as the culmination of being in essence and the notion up to this point really are, then every word is drawn from what we've already read in the previous books. Okay. This multiplicity as self-external objectivity has an indifferent subsistence, which in time and space, if these could already be mentioned here, is a mutual externality of wholly diverse and self-subsistent elements. Okay. So here he's starting to talk about the philosophy of nature and what is talked about there. He's talking about what self-external objectivity is, right? This multiplicity of the notion. But in life, externality is at the same time present as the simple determinateness of its notion. Thus, the soul is an omnipresent outpouring of itself into this multiplicity, and at the same time remains absolutely the simple oneness of the concrete notion with itself. So, being an external life is what he's talking about in this last sentence. Life, as self-externalized idea, is the outpouring. No part of it is not the notion, as he's talking about here, right? Everything is right in nature, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be in nature. Otherwise, it wouldn't be life, for that matter. The thinking that clings to the determinations of the relationships of reflection of the formal notion, when it comes to consider life, this unity of its notion to the externality of its objectivity in the absolute multiplicity of atomistic matter finds all its thoughts without exception are of no avail. The omnipresence of the simple in manifold externality is for reflection an absolute contradiction. And here he's talking about common sense, or the understanding alone, right? And his reflection must at the same time apprehend this omnipresence from its perception of life and therefore admit the actuality of this idea it is an incomprehensible mystery for it because it does not grasp the notion and the notion as the substance of life. So here he's talking about what life looks like to consciousness as talked about in the phenomenology of spirit. Prior to the scientific point of view, talking about being in the being the fundamental condition of reality, you know, it's a big question mark, right? And you know, I think the sciences are permeated with this. They try and try and try to make an empirical judgment that brings together what we see and the nature of it. And they can't. They fall into the body and soul question that Descartes did, unfortunately. And I have absolutely no qualification to say that, by the way, because I haven't read much Descartes, but I've read enough to where I can. Anyway, so
We
sorry,
also,
I'm going to finish this up real quick. Okay, this simple life, however, is not only omnipresent; it is absolutely the subsistence and immanent substance of its objectivity. But as subjective substance, it is the urge, and moreover, the specific urge of the particular difference, and no less essentially the one and universal urge of the specialized difference that reduces this its particularization into unity and maintains it therein. It is only as this negative unity of its objectivity and particularization that life is a self-related life that is for itself a soul. As such, it is essentially an individual which relates itself to objectivity as to an other, to a non-living nature. Consequently, the original judgment of life consists in this, that it detaches itself as an individual subject from objectivity, and in constituting itself, the negative unity of the notion makes the presupposition of an immediate objectivity. So think about that. Detaching oneself, Kyle, you have just, in living, you look around at everything around you and you detach yourself as an individual from the background of the reality around you. You're the subject, it's the object, and you're forever apart, right? And the phenomenology proved that actually you never actually detached yourself, but you think you did because that's the way your thought process works just day to day. The non dialectical, as the Marxists would say, the non speculative ego running around thinking that it's a form of God and everything else is the creation around it. Bring in a little bit of biblical flavor. Okay, I'll shut up. Kyle, Jim.
in modern epistemology starts with Descartes, and in Descartes, the subject and object are separate. They're
Yeah.
separate things, and that created a whole set of problems that epistemologists have struggled to solve ever since. Now, because if you're separating subject and object, how can you prove the existence of the external world? It's really
Yeah,
hard.
you can't. You start running into ridiculous claims like, well, uh, with our subjective individuality, we created the world around us through our thinking about it.
Another one problem you get is the problem of other minds. You can you might be able to prove the existence of your own mind, though, through Descartes' reasoning.
Yeah,
But how do you prove the existence of other minds?
yeah.
That's another unsolved problem.
Well, and some people have tried to solve it by saying no one else exists except for me. Like,
Yeah,
can you imagine the ego on that asshole who said that?
Also
And
get a brain in the vat, philosophy
yeah.
conceptions, or even Boltzmann brain, the modern version.
Really? That's
Of
cool.
Boltzmann brain.
I haven't
Oh,
heard
it's
of
just
it.
sort of in a theory where we have a universe that, you know, entropy goes out to many different states and then kind of can come back into form galaxies and stuff. That odds are you're not a brain that's been formed in the Big Bang and the early universe that's evolving continuously. You're just a moment of a brain having come together to think it has a history before it dissolves back into random particles.
I have so many questions about the presuppositions of that, though. Like nature taking millions of years to create complex organisms. That makes sense to me
Yeah.
historically.
Talking about 10, like 10 to the Google like years of random motion at that point. It's just if it will can happen, it will happen, kind of. The odds eventually happen.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that reasoning coincides with the one that said that eventually the monkey will type out Shakespeare,
Yeah, it is.
and
They don't
that's
they,
already been debunked.
right. They use Boltzmann brains as the equivalent of an infinity in math, that there's a problem.
Yeah, a big problem.
Yeah. They may have solved a direction to solve it right now that I don't understand very well, but that's yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Jim, 1649, life is therefore.
Life is therefore first to be considered as a living individual, that is, for itself, the subjective totality, and is presupposed as indifferent to an objectivity that confronts it as indifferent.
Yep. And so in this sentence he repeats a theme that was earlier. You remember when we started talking about how essence in its immediacy is indifferent to being in its totality? It's basically the same logical argument, only at this stage of the spiral. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. All right. Kyle, 1650. Secondly.
Secondly, it is the life process, the process of sublating its presupposition, positing as negative the objectivity that is indifferent to it, and actualizing itself as the objectivity's power in negative unity. By so doing, it makes itself into the universal that is the unity of itself and its other.
So this is I'm not sure if this is the becoming. It's the lifing.
Yeah, it's
It's
consuming too.
lifing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's lifing right now. um
It
and
is, yeah.
notice how no, notice how um so the objectivity behind it, the rest of reality, um that's indifferent to it and actualizing itself as that objectivity's power and negative unity. It reminds me of how Marx talks about how when the commodity is produced, you go from you go from an objectivity that production. I'm, I'm trying to use the words, but they're not all fitting. If you think about the raw materials and the means of production that goes into creating a commodity, right? The process of creating a commodity sublates its presupposition, which is the raw materials, and the process is the process of actualizing the commodity, right? And valorizing um, value. Is that what it is? I think
Yeah.
it's the self valorization, right?
Yeah, it's just purpose that is self-fulfilling, which is what life is, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And 1651. Hence, life is thirdly the genus process, the process of sublating its individualization and relating itself to its objective existence as to itself. Accordingly, this process is on the one hand the return to its notion and the repetition of the first diremption, the becoming of a new individuality, and the death of the first immediate one, raw materials get used up, right? But on the other hand, the notion of life that has withdrawn into itself is the becoming of the notion that is in relationship with itself and exists universally and freely for itself, the transition into cognition. You remember how Marx, when he talks about the commodity fetishism, we get this idea that the commodity as it is produced is a thinking object. It has social characteristics and has social intercourse with other commodities. When actually you pull back the veil and it's just people talking to people about the things, right? This is this is one of those I think this is one of those insights where you can really see how the be, because of yeah, it's any object with the original judgment as talked about earlier. The original judgment of life is often applied to everything around us, even in inanimate objects. And we talk about talking rocks and shit, when in reality, we're just projecting the original judgment on everything that comes under our judgment, right? That's where the commodity fetishism comes from, is taking this judgment of the life process that we're a part of and around us and thinking that it applies to everything, you know, over universalizing this process into everything that we see. And I think it's to Marx's credit in his book that he's able to uncover this and yeah, yes, honey, go get a popsicle. Um, he's able to pull those apart and allow you to see the objective and the subjective side correctly, as opposed to what it is under ruling class.
You know, in another way, I guess we could say it's misattributing the life process to what is merely the process, the purpose that has been done by, external forces, basically. So it's sort of like, assuming,
I think I said that, but yeah.
yeah, yeah, just reiterating to make sure I'm understanding what you said. Yeah, that
Yeah, you're fine.
okay.
No, because purpose
Yeah,
is definitely in there,
yeah,
and I didn't address it, but yeah, that's totally in there. Because life process as a purpose is its conatus to keep
right.
living and to reproduce itself. When you're
It's
talking about the conatus of capital, because it's a finite object, um, it's often treated as for itself, when really it's for an other, us, right? It's the capitalist purpose to produce so that surplus value is created and then realized.
yeah. The Does that come about because they sort of like, oh, this is the natural state of things, and therefore this is a projection of life. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Their argument is at bottom that capital is in and for itself
Mhm.
when it's not. Now you can define capital in and for itself, but it's always going to be as a process, a- as a result, a historical process for us. Okay, it's an activity of spirit at bottom. Okay, it's not an activity of nature. Its reality and its structure are logically driven, and so it is a form of the idea, but it is not a natural formation. It's a formation of the spirit. And you notice above that he separates spirit from nature. Um, shit, how did he say this? I want to get this right. For here life is to be taken generally in its proper sense as natural life, for what is called the life of spirit as spirit is its peculiar nature that stands opposed to mere life, just as we speak too of the nature of spirit, although spirit is not a natural being and is rather the opposite of nature. Okay? So if something like capitalism, is part of the life of the spirit, it stands opposed to uh, mere life or, you know, natural life, and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's interesting how this works because there's mere life, which is logically structured, as we've already said, being an essence and the notion up until this point. And then there's natural life and the life of the spirit. And he differentiates each one of those and says, you can't mistake one for the other. You cannot, what do I want to say? Mistake one for the other or sort of lump all three into it. When I first read this section, I thought, okay, life. He's talking about nature. No, life populates both spirit and nature in their various ways, but because they are peculiar ways, they're different from each other, and you can't really. Okay, and so he gets into the living individual next, and then the life process, and then the genus. And I'm going to ask you guys if you feel comfortable just jumping to cognition now, or you want to next time start going through these A, B, and C. What do you guys think? Or do you think you've got a pretty good handle on what was given in this preliminary? I mean, we've all read it.
Yeah. I do think, like I said, I was reading maybe, and I feel like I was getting a lot more out of the living sections. Like, oh, yeah,
Okay.
now I understand what he said here.
Did this help, Kyle?
Yeah, it is coming back around to this. It's just sort of like, yeah, right. Um, I guess I got so focused on trying to understand his motions that when guy went through it, coming back out makes more sense. So like the first part is sort of the universal of life being split into its singulars through this life forms, and then that life form itself interacts with its environment in order to keep functioning, the urge to consume,
Yeah.
which interesting, he does talk about sense in the way that's a universal of the body with many singulars of sense internally,
Mhm.
like a Humean subject is what maybe compares it to. But then that allows itself to then it externalizes itself after it discovers that that itself is also itself
Yeah.
consumption. And now we start getting into what is it? The genus where the universal, like it's like the life form that particularizes itself into from its individual, like a house cat is a cat from the genus, the universal, that particularizes itself into individual house cats from that perspective. Now it's like the universal is the particular.
Well, not just the house cat, but us too, because
Well,
this is life, and life permeates both nature and
right.
spirit.
But as a genus, the human is not the humanness of life is not it's a different like there's a different level of a particular there. Maybe that's what I'm thinking. It's sort of like there's a catness, the humanness that
Okay.
itself is a genus
The,
of the
y-
individuals.
no, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think in the last three here, 16, 49, 50, and 51, he's talking about what lifeness is in the immediacy, in the process, and in the, I guess, result. And the result shows up in anything that's living, including us. It would exclude, and you're right, it would exclude cognition because we're not at cognition yet. So this
And
is just lifeness, I guess you could.
trying to, because I haven't completed reading it, is interesting though. Somehow it's like using reproduction, which itself shows up as another spurious infinity that turns into a true infinity, where the continual generations as a spurious turns into the whole process of reproduction. And logically, through that, Hegel is able to arrive at cognition that I'm not sure at yet.
Yeah. 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 How does he say this? On the one hand, the notion of life that has withdrawn into itself is the becoming of the notion that is in relationship with itself and exists universally and freely for itself, the
Yes,
transition
right
into
there.
cognition.
Right.
Yeah.
So I might just read about that if we feel the need to. Maybe the transition to cognition might be the most useful part, if anything, which is toward the bottom of genus, I would say.
Yeah.
I like how
Well,
his transition is way shorter than the depth of detail I was reading.
let's put it this way.
Yeah.
So for this next time, I think our assignment should be uh, A, B, and C reading. But next time we will read aloud C, genius, or genus, because it's because it's short enough to where we could get it all in pretty well next
Yeah.
time, and then we can have more. We can have more of a conversation of what life is and its process in itself before the transition into cognition. And that way, next time we can read genus and maybe these first few paragraphs transitioning into cognition. I think that would be the best. I think you're right.
Particular, which is this one particular is a singular that itself is a particular for even smaller singulars, which is just sort of the kind of fractal, I guess, perspective of everything, except life is the ultimate universal and all that.
I'm still trying to parse the difference between. See, I have a pretty decent. Yes, honey, just one moment. I have a pretty good grasp elementarily on universal and individual. It's the particular that kind of trips me up a little because I think, okay, one, a few, and all.
It's to
But
me
it's a little more subtle than that.
it's like it's a particular, it's like a universal and a singular at the same time. Is how I see it.
That's it. That's the syllogism. It's a
Yeah.
universal and a singular at the same time.
Right. So from the process
Okay,
of the universal
that's blowing my
singular,
head.
and then from the singular, it's a
A
universal.
minute, honey.
Daddy has your school.
In just a minute, honey. Okay.
Daddy has your school.
No.
Dad has your class.
Okay. I'm gonna have to go.
Okay.
But yeah. So for next time, read A, B, and C in life, and next time we'll read the genus out loud and talk more about it because I really think this is key to getting at what the idea is.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And if we get this wrong, well, then we'll have to show up next year and read it all over again, and no one wants that. All right, you guys, comrades, have a good one. I'll see you next
Got it
week.
wrong. We write a book on Hegel. It'll be just as misleading as all the others.
It will be, Jim. Oh my God. Oh. All right, take it easy.